Welcome back. Our upcoming session for today is Unfamiliar Trails, Women Writers on Travel Writing, a conversation between Taran Khan, Alice Albania, Shubhangi Swaroop, and moderated by Rehana Munir. Rehana is the author of Paper Moon and is an independent writer with a weekly humor column in HT Brunch and a cinema column in Arts Illustrated magazine. Taran N. Khan is a journalist and a writer based in Mumbai. She has published widely in India and internationally, including in Quinerica, Al Jazeera, The Caravan, and Himmel South Asian, and has received fellowships from MacDowell, Jan Mikulski Foundation, and Swiss Arts Council Pro Helvetia. From 2006 to 2013, Khan spent long periods living and working in Kabul. Shadow City is her first book. Alice Albania is an English journalist and author whose first book, Empires of the Indus, won several awards. Albania read English literature at Cambridge University and South Asian history at SOAS. Shubhangi Swaroop is a writer and an educator. Latitudes of Longing, her debut novel, was a bestseller soon after its release in India. It won the Tata Lit Live Prize for Debut Fiction and was shortlisted for the JCB Prize for Indian Literature and longlisted for the DSC Prize. She has also won awards for gender sensitivity in feature writing. Join us in a session that explores travel writing through the literary journeys of three celebrated authors entwined with ideas of history, geography, and identity.
We have three celebrated women authors, and I'm saying women because it's an important qualifier here. We spent some time trying to figure out what this session is going to be about. And I think everyone agreed that there is a particular quality to travel and travel writing when it's done by women, and I think part of this session is an exploration of what that really means. It can sound very simplistic, why put a gender definition to this? But I think there are some interesting ideas to be probed here. The three writers here look at literary, they have literary journeys, whether it's fiction or non-fiction. And I think there's so many ideas right now swimming in my head. Let me begin with the first. And I think Alice is in the best position to perhaps begin with this. Alice, your book, not only does it travel through a specific geography, I think it's a kind of a time travel too. You go back in time in many ways. I think that can be said of Taran and Shubhangi too. But I'd like your thoughts on that. One, why the Indus? And why, you're going back to the beginnings of civilization in many ways. Can you talk us through that? Well, why did you pick that particular river and that particular civilization?
I was reading a lot, as much as I could lay my hands on in between working, and I was reading. I kept on coming across references to the Indus, and I thought to myself, in my patriotic way, oh, it must be somewhere running all the way through India. Where is it? And actually, because it was so important, and actually it turned out that it had been lopped off and become part of Pakistan. And so immediately I began thinking about going to this river, which seemed like it had maybe been the mother river of the Rig Veda and the early kind of one of the places where early thought of the people who migrated. Some people said they migrated into India. Had happened, and so I left my job in Delhi and I went back to London, where I'm from, and I did an MA in South Asian history, tailored to be a history on the Indus, and I went further and further back in history, and eventually I went to Pakistan to stand on the banks of this mighty Indus. And of course, history and time and past and all these things are forever changing. And it feels like this happens in my own work now, which is about Britain. It's about the islands around Britain. And I'm doing the same thing. I'm going back through geography, going back in time, looking for how we tell stories of our cultures. Because this is all storytelling. There are some facts, But if you're in Pakistan, you're delighted by the idea of the notion of people migrating into your country, because that's what happened at partition, and that's what's happened in your telling of Islamic history. The same history can be told in different ways and different facts selected and taken out, and that was really what I learned in. It was a whole re-education for me, coming and living and working and writing in India. I just looked everything I had to relearn, including my own history, my own politics, my own education, and that's been such a wonderful thing, and it's helped me through these next two books. So it wasn't just the non-fiction book about the Indus, there was also the novel about the Mahabharata and the retelling of that story, and then these two books about Britain, which are coming out now, which are about how we tell stories of our own cultures, and that's a whole nother, yeah. There we go.
That's, among the things that you were saying, what struck me is this thing about, you said there are few facts and there are many stories. And I'm interested in how a writer of non-fiction deals with those tonal shifts. And I've asked Taran this before, and I hope we can come back to this. How do you sound like storytelling has so many facts in it, but tone gets really dry sometimes, or some writers are not able to seamlessly shift between historical occurrences and the stories that you weave around them. So anyway, perhaps we'll come back to this question a little later. Since you mentioned that you're going to be writing two books now about Britain, and you talked about islands and their history, I think that segs into a section of Shubhangi's novel. That's my favorite section of a novel. It begins with life on an island, and it's the Andaman Islands. It begins in the decades immediately following the Indian independence. Shubhangi, I read somewhere that you hadn't really visited any of these places.
Yeah, no, I hadn't.
Actually sat down, to write about them.
Yeah.
Tell me a little bit about that. What happened?
So I had this, I thought it was a very easy and, very practical idea of setting all the stories on the tectonically active fault line. And I literally researched the map and what are the places that fall on this, fall on the tectonic. And I just narrowed down on some places, and I thought I would stay there and research and write about the stories that emerge from the geology and the geography and the natural history, so to say. I mean, of course, it helps that it was a debut novel and I didn't know what this undertakes, so I would have thought a little bit more about it. I visited a lot more places actually than the 4 sections that make it to the novel. I explored the northeast of India also, and Bhutan, and parts of Uttarakhand too, which are on the fault line. But these were the 4 that sort of helped me structure the story.
Yeah.
And made it.
Yeah, no, it was really, travel writing is what we're talking about, but something about the way you wrote about those places, again, the boundaries between fiction and non-fiction. I think that there was some blurring of that, because it's a book
absolutely.
that, it's a very informative book, quite apart from being completely engaging and marvelous in its world building. But yeah, which brings me then to Taran. I think your book, it's funny that we should be talking about travel writing this year, because that's the only way we're getting to really travel at all, most of us. And I don't think Goa and Uttarakhand count, because they're just, you're not traveling, you're escaping to those places, in India at least. But then you went to Kabul, of course, over a period of a few years. And is it 6 or 8 years? How long were you? How many visits?
About 7 years, 2006 to 13.
Yeah, and your book, of course, begins very strongly. I was completely sucked in, because you very cleverly, you wrote that line. You said, the first thing I was told in Kabul was not to walk, don't do this. So it's transgressive from the word go. Alice is talking about her motive, it is very political kind of a reason for writing it. With you, again, it's very obvious from the first page. So what was that like, and where did this define? It is defined, of course, but clearly there's more to it. You wouldn't just set out to break rules for the sake of it. What really compelled you to do that, knowing full well the dangers involved?
I mean, yeah, it's interesting, Rihanna, because like you said, I didn't set out to be defiant or it wasn't a sort of a statement that I was making. But because being from Aligarh, town in North India, this was so familiar to me to be told not to walk, that it seemed to make Kabul familiar to hear this when I got there. And I just thought that, well, maybe then I do know how to figure out walking here because I figured it out there. I figured out how to negotiate where I can go, where I might not go, where perhaps I can go in a certain way, but not in certain other ways. So these are all sort of intuitions and skills that I felt I had brought to this city, which seemed quite familiar, but was also quite unfamiliar. So for that reason, I think it felt like something I could try. And once I tried, I could just simply continue. And of course, then the book deepens the idea of these expeditions into beyond the physical space, into memory, into fables. And it was a useful device for me as a writer to explore also. But I think the fact of being a woman seeking mobility in this way was definitely, it felt extremely close to me. It seemed intuitive. It seemed to almost come from the body itself, because so much of what I felt about Kabul was the stuff that I had to leave out of my writing. Initially, as a journalist, when I'd be writing, I would leave out a lot of stuff because it didn't fit the form of a news story or of a feature story or even of a travel story. If I tried to, fit that stuff in, it would end up being on the cutting floor, as it were. So what then was the language to speak of this city? What then was the form I could take? And the idea of a body moving through the space, the idea of a woman moving through these stories is a compelling one that I found was a useful way to be able to say all the things that I felt were interesting. And I do think that a part of it for me, also why I was so close to this idea, is because even in life, I just get lost a lot, like I'm not a so-called good walker in the sense that I don't have a great sense of direction. I'm constantly sort of mistaking landmarks. I think I know where I am, but I'm somewhere completely different. So to me, I think this was interesting I began by thinking of this as a disadvantage. Like, oh, if I'm writing a book about walking, but I'm not a terrific walker, is this something I can even do? Is this something that's allowed to me? And I think the journey for me was to see it as a woman, as a writer, as someone who just likes to explore places and ideas, to think, well, maybe this is an asset, and sort of going off the track or taking detours or just wandering around isn't a disadvantage in that sense. So I think this book taught me all of that. Being in Kabul taught me a lot of that. Just simply the act of writing as a woman about an unfamiliar place. I do feel it was an act of learning in this sense.
Yeah, and I've said this before. It's such an empowering book because it really is. It didn't make me want to go to Kabul. I'll say that, but it did make me want to walk and wander and get lost and all of that. And the connections between writing and walking. That is something else that your book does so well. Something about this free exploration. I wonder if Alice had a similar experience. I mean, was your book or your experience of writing it, was there a lot of getting lost? Or did you have a compass? Did you have specific things? Of course, you were covering a very vast geographical area. Did it have to be much more controlled and structured? Or was part of it just going, it's literally flowing with the river or what's left of it? So what was that like?
Well, it was different at every stage because there were different people and different ways of getting around and different things I had to do. But when I look back on that time, the two parts that I loved the most. One was where I stayed still. It was the chapter about the Shidis, and I went and moved in with a family first in Hyderabad and then in Badin, and I really didn't move, and that was how that chapter came about, and that bit of research, and it wasn't travel writing, it was staying put writing. And then the second bit was the walk I did in northern Pakistan, and it was a chapter about Alexander the Great, and there was all these texts I was carrying in my head, things that Alexander's historians had written about the India that they encountered, and they kind of the way they brought their own things with them. So they got totally overexcited about Bacchus. They found ivy suddenly, which grows above so many meters high, and I reached the same point. Suddenly there was ivy, and I kind of felt this, this deep history moment where I'm a stranger here too, and I've just found ivy, hooray! I could kind of feel this thing bubbling through these texts. But walking was really I mean, it was so hard to walk in Pakistan because nobody understood why you wanted to walk. You would say, is this the way to wherever? And they'd say, look, there's a bus just coming or can I lend you some money for the bus, or what are you doing walking? And also how I walked was also really revealing. I just walked too fast. I really like walking around fast. And everyone kept on saying to me, you're walking too, you've got to slow down. There was a phrase, apka chelse. They know you from your gait. They know you apka chelse. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Yeah. I just couldn't walk in the way, even wearing a burqa, wearing a veil, wearing whatever it was, how I just didn't, it got through, my strangeness got through. So that was really interesting. And I find the same with these new books that I'm writing, that when I'm walking, I can drive now. I learned to drive since moving back to Britain, and you go so fast through the countryside, or I cycle a lot, but it's really the walking that there's something, it's how we migrated all over the place as a species. That's what we did. We walked, and there's something very therapeutic about it. You learn to order your thoughts, new thoughts come into your brain. I really think it is a form of therapy, walking. And so the bits of these islands that I've walked around are the ones I hold in my head the most, with the most love and fondness and clarity. And also, it's a form of inspiration, I think, walking. And whether you get lost or not, sometimes you get lost, sometimes you have to go from A to B in a hurry. But yes, there's something about putting one foot in front of the other in terms of the brain.
It's like one word after the other on a page.
Yes, yes.
Sometimes if you're lucky, you're dancing on the page, but that's a rare kind of event. Shubhani, what about you? Did you did you start writing the novel while you were in these places, or did you do your research and then come back and put it all together? What was it like?
So I think I viewed I would replace the travel writing or the traveling with exploring, because that for fiction seems more holistic. You're exploring so many layers, not just the region and the characters, but also going deep within, because fiction is that sort of, I am as much a resource as anything else I come across in my experiences. So it was all kinds of explorations. And since the problem and the challenge with fiction is you aspire to inhabit someone else's skin. So to speak with that level of confidence, you have to be confident about the culture and the topography and so many things. And this meant that I actually live and work in these places. I took 7 years to write, and I pretty much did different kinds of odd jobs in all the regions. In Myanmar, I worked as an undercover reporter. In Ladakh, I volunteered as a school teacher in the villages by the LOC. In Kathmandu, I tried to fit into the dance bar scene in various ways, and it worked, so that was good. Yeah. And it's interesting to hear about the different ways that we have we become part of the environment. For me, I found that it was, it was easy for me to be invisible in many of these locations. I don't know how. Maybe sheepish women can be just I'm not a 6 foot, what do you call, big chested guy walking down, looking very purposeful. I'm the exact opposite. So it was easy for me to get lost in the locations. Many times people thought I'm a local. Like, for example, in the dance bar, they thought I'm a bar dancer, which is great. But I think my vulnerability and my innocuousness helped me just fit in, and that became my the source of my writing. When you are sort of tiny and scared, I paid attention to the crabs and the grasshoppers and the children and all the people who actually I didn't set out to write about. For example, even when I was interviewing the opium farmer, I was drawn to his 4-year-old granddaughter who was just in an underwear roaming around. I mean, things like that, from my vantage point, I have a very different world to engage with. And that became the biggest character in my book, I think, the tiny and the seemingly, unspoken, minuscule, little things, the leaves and the trees. Like nature, I think, is the biggest character in the book, because when you are scared and alone, nature tends to be the most comforting thing anyway, and just opens up to take you in a way that maybe a stranger may not.
No, absolutely. I was just kind of reliving, when you said you did these undercover jobs and did this and that, I was trying to think of the characters in your book. And again, before this session, I was doing a little bit of homework and I read a few reviews of all your works. And I think apart from Shubhangi, your island part of the book has been universally acclaimed, and I wish you write another book which just takes off from that part. But that's just me. Taran, I was reading one interview. I think it was in the Guardian, I think, and it was a beautiful review. And but the end said something that was quite, it made me smile. Because it said, I wish that the writer had said, revealed a little bit more about themselves. So I wish we knew a little more about Taran. And how do you react to that kind of comment? Or it's not really a criticism. It was like, oh, I wish kind of a thing. So how do you keep yourself, your personality and your personal life away from writing that is in many ways so intimate, You can't really leave yourself out in any real way. And yet, in your book in particular, I think there's been a lot of control. You don't see Taran as Taran in the book. So can you tell us a little bit about that? How do you manage that?
That review, when I sent it to a friend, she said, I don't think that last line would ever have been written about a man. So I don't know. I don't know, but I do feel that I've had a few people ask me that question. And I was always clear that this has to be a book about a city. It's not a book about the journalist. We've had a fair bunch of those, of journalists exploring Kabul or other war zones. And to me, that wasn't the interesting story. The interesting story was definitely the people in the city itself, what I saw. I didn't try to hide myself. I'm quite comfortable putting myself on the page in general in my reportage. I don't feel like it's a taboo or anything. But in this case, I think my decision was to use myself to serve a purpose, which was to be the scaffolding of the book. And I think it was simple for me to do that in the sense that of course, the reader has to know me to be able to see the city that I'm showing them and all the connections I'm making between my own life in Aligarh, my grandfather in Aligarh, my memories of growing up in Aligarh, or even what I'm thinking of while I'm in Kabul. Of course, the reader needs to know the person who's telling them these stories. And I also feel it's important not to write myself out in that sense, that I'm not an omniscient narrator. I'm not some kind of, in a documentary would be a voice of God kind of narration. I wasn't interested in that kind of positioning. So I don't feel like I deliberately held back. I think in that sense, I was extremely keen to share the things that I felt the reader would need or would enjoy to see the city through my perspective. And I had to be clear that this was my perspective. There's so many ways of seeing the city, so many ways of telling these stories. So, and I feel like I wrote about the things that are dearest to me. I wrote about my grandfather. That's the piece of my heart. And I wrote about books. I wrote about music and my family. So I feel that there is a lot of me there. It's not in the format of a memoir. It's not about the journalist being transformed or my deepest feelings or emotions when I see what's going on in Kabul. But yes, that was deliberate. That it had to be, the story has to be about the city. It wasn't of interest to me to have it any other way.
Yeah. Yeah, and just for the record, I don't share that criticism or made me smile because when I was reading it, and especially because we have Aligarh in common, to me, the fact that you took the reader there, it's actually giving them a glimpse of where you come from, which in some ways is even more than, your favorite color or your favorite actor or whatever people want to know about an author.
Right, yeah.
Alice, what are your views on this kind of thing? Putting yourself in the book, leaving yourself out, or how do you negotiate that? Because there is a balance in a book of non-fiction in particular. When fiction has its own issues, and I've written one book, and the only questions I get about that is: are you the protagonist? Did you love this boy? Did you not love that boy? I mean, that's all I hear. So, how do you deal with this kind of? How do you deal with you, the person, and you, the author? Well, what's it like?
I mean, I think it's in a way it's similar, non-fiction and fiction, in that you are always using bits of your experience, your life, your thoughts but you're using them. Well, that's what I feel. You know, you're ultimately telling a story, and there's going to be something that you did somewhere that is a really good way of getting across what you want to say about a place or a thing or a book, whether it's in fiction or in non-fiction. And there are going to be other parts of your life which you know, and you and your experience which are irrelevant, and instead you're telling a story of other people's experience or a river's trajectory through humankind's effect on it, and therefore it's about being judicious and choosing the story that tells the one that you want to get across the best. So my new book, which is a novel, which is very much grows out of the non-fiction book I've been writing about Britain, which is Islands, and I have an Alice character in that partly because I read so many novels in my ill-spent youth, which had you know, people like Nabokov or somebody who puts himself in his novel. I went back and reread them. I was so shocked that I'd liked them so much. And now I think about him as a total pervert. But at the time, I think I'd come out of them from reading Samuel Beckett, who was so, anyway, he was at least a little bit more vibrant. But he puts himself in his novels. You know, he's very sexy and erudite, and he's sitting in the corner in a cafe drinking a cup of coffee and watching his characters. And he's kind of, you think, oh, wow, the author. And I guess I was writing my books. I was, you know, had young people running around me. I had lots of other things to do. I had jobs I was supposed to be doing, and I didn't feel at all kind of erudite and sexy at that point. But I think there is definitely a space for female authors to have, you know, the erudite sexy moment. But I think I wanted to be honest with how I felt about various aspects of writing. And I also wanted to get across the connection between my non-fiction work and the fiction, and what I felt, what I couldn't get across in the non-fiction. You know, there's a side of non-fiction. You can't do too much, too many flights of fancy, otherwise you lose people and they don't believe you anymore. Whereas there is definitely, so there were things I wanted to put in about women and islands and Britain, which probably won't end up being in my non-fiction because it would just be a whole different book. And so I put them in the novel. And there were also, and this very much grows out of my experience of writing Empires of the Indus, where I came across all these references in Greek, ancient Greek and Sanskrit texts to this land of the women in the north. And then I really, in real life, got on a bus and went to the land of the women in the north. And sure enough, it turned out to be Ladakh really was, in many ways, especially in comparison to other places I was visiting in the Indus Valley, really was a land of women. And I brought that to my non-fiction and fiction writing about Britain, where I'm reading in these similarly ancient texts, not Sanskrit ones, obviously, but ancient Greek, Roman, Latin texts, then Irish, early medieval Irish texts, where they talk about these islands of women. And so with my learning from having written Empires of the Indus, I'm saying to myself, where the hell are these islands of women? They must exist. You know, they're in these texts. They must be there in real life. And they're really hard to find. So I had to make them up. And therefore, yes, I think it's about telling the story and being judicious but mostly it's about the story rather than the writer, I would say. I agree with Tara, as always.
Shubhangi, this just to go back to a question that I had or a comment I'd made early in this session. The tonal shifts between a fact and fiction in any novel, whether it's a novel or a work of non-fiction, you're kind of moving between facts and you're moving to your interpretation, your descriptions. In your book, it begins with someone who works for the National Forestry Department post-independence, and so there's all of that. And I'm sure there's a lot of research involved in what went on there. I think our book, what it does so well is that it doesn't, you don't see the work there. It's just flowing. The magic realism kind of speaks with the facts, which speaks with the history, which talks to the, fabulation, whatever you want to call it. How do you manage that? Because I, particularly as a writer, find those tonal shifts to be difficult to achieve. This is a slightly technical question, but is it a conscious thought in your head, or it just happens? What goes on?
It's like the answer is a lot more banal than one would think. I'm used to faffing and making stuff up. That's what I did in school in most of my papers and my graduate degree. And I shouldn't speak about my journalism now, but I don't even see a shift. I'm at that point. of confabulation. But I say if I mean this I did do a lot of research, all the science and natural history and deep history, as I call it, as in earth history, is quite accurate. Any description of a bird, even if it is in the passing, like the kakapo, which features for like 3 lines in the end. I've spent a lot of time researching all those aspects, even the geology. How can Mount Everest possibly shrink and not be the highest anymore? What is the physics behind it and things like that to make it possible? The geodetics and stuff. So I went to town with that. Um, and I just view, I had to actually use a lot of my, what is it, the left brain to figure out how to um, weave this in a way where the reader thinks that, oh, it's magic realism and confabulation, but they are actually experiencing the point. It's sort of almost like you, how shall I put it? You disarm the person with magic realism, but there is a greater point to be made. And for example, the ghosts, I use them as a device. First, we have human ghosts and the ghost of a goat. But then I go from animals to extinct creatures to continents and oceans, extinct oceans, and that's actually a way of telling a deep history of the earth. Because, like the botanist in the beginning, I was just thinking to myself, I can't have these characters as mouthpieces very conveniently, having the profession that I need them to have to sort of give that expository worldview, like this is what happened to the Tethys or the Indus River and things like that. So I literally searched for those devices, and the devices attract attention to themselves, but they achieve a certain purpose. And I think once we can sort of tap into what devices work for us, then the tone just comes very naturally. It's not, I feel actually this idea of the tone marrying the two is sort of, if I may, I don't know how to articulate this point, but I feel it's almost like a male writer thing. Is concern. I don't know. I mean, it really isn't so much of a concern if we can let go. But this sort of, when we try to put the intellect a little too much, then it can sort of get in the way. And it's almost like you have to trust yourself and go ahead, then go ahead. And I guess the reason why I would say male writers, this was some of the advice I got initially. And I realized it's coming more from the male writers. So I just ignored it. Like you have to trust the voice and just go with the voice, and the voice knows how to do its job.
Yeah, yeah. This is one of the questions I had in mind for this session. Have any of you had consciously told about how to structure your work or the criticism, just like Shubhangi said? And how have you dealt with that? Has it been different with male writers and female writers, readers across the gender spectrum? What has that been like? Because I know that, and we're coming to you now. Your book has a very strong, to me, it had a very strong feminist tone in the best way. I don't know if there's a bad way, but there is the best way. It's especially when you talk about being in a house in Kabul, which is very male. There are just men around you, and then you talk about that. You bring you actually say that, and while reading it again, it made me feel this is a slide. It's a very it was a small thing, you're coming back in the evenings and you said there are people around you and there's no woman in that space. And that you made a point of articulating that. And through your book, I see that. When you go to the wedding, for example, you talk about who's wearing what and how you felt about not perhaps being as dressed up as the rest of the people there. So these are, between the feminine and the feminist and all of that, I could hear a woman's voice very strongly. Do you think that is a kind of, your book is a woman walks Kabul is the best, I think. I don't know what your views are on that line, but I think it's the best descriptor for your book. Did you receive some kind of veiled warnings about not making it that? And when you got your critiques and reviews, did that become a point of focus? And what was that like?
I think for me, the process, like I said, I talked about it a little bit earlier, but it was more to do with trusting myself. As Shubhangi said, I think she raised a very, very important point, which was listening to yourself and trusting yourself when you're writing. And I think in my experience, a lot of women tend to struggle with this. And I think partly in my case, it was also because Kabul is so deeply inscribed by these robust male voices, very often from the West. And of course, there are women who have also written about Kabul and Afghanistan. But the tradition is quite strongly male. And I think for me, it was learning to trust that what I'm seeing, for instance, the wedding halls, just that party, is the question always comes up, is this worth writing about? Is what I'm seeing, interesting to anyone except myself? And this is a question I think across the board writers do face. But in my case, I felt it quite strongly because I was also drawn to things that are not traditionally thought of as issues. Like if you write about Kabul, you tend to come across certain issues or certain hot topics that you feel a book on Kabul would address. Or if it's not quite travel writing, what I've done. It's writing about conflict, and it's writing about a war zone. So again, there is this tradition of journalism that speaks about conflict in a certain way. And I was interested in writing about, bread and about wedding parties and about also just, what it's like to go on picnics in Kabul. So this was for me, I think, the central process pretty late in the writing process, I think, because while I was there, it didn't strike me as being something that I have to sort of negotiate, because I just did what I wanted to really, and that seemed fine and natural and fun and interesting. But when I was writing the voice, which sort of seeks to silence the intuition, I think, would often say, well, is this something that would even be interesting or worthwhile? Is it something that you would expect to see in a book on Kabul? And I think that was really the moment where I learned that, as Shubhangi said, that if you let this sort of critical voice take over, then the book will change fundamentally. So finding the structure of walking and wandering and being free in that sense was quite central to my being able to then move ahead and to write the book in the way I wanted to and to talk about all these spaces. I think I wouldn't say that I was seeking to make it very, very, gendered in the sense other than what I already am. But at the same time, I wasn't going to shy away from it. Of course, I would talk about the women's side of the wedding hall because that's what I saw. And of course, I would talk about the dancing and about the images I saw there in the bazaar or going for shopping with my shoes or noticing when I'm the only woman in the house, because this is what I saw. So it was simply also a matter of recounting my own experience there.
Yeah. Sure. And Alice, in your while you were researching and living that experience, I think you had apart from being a woman, you're a Western woman. So how did that come into play in your interactions with the people that you were interviewing, living with, working among? What was that like? Was it an impediment? I'm sure it was in some places and not in others. So is there anything from that you recall of particular interest? What was that like?
I don't ever remember being impeded by by anything really. I think in a way in Pakistan especially, I wasn't very classifiable because there are not very many tourists. It's not like India. There's not very many tourists wandering around, and therefore I'm clearly not a Pakistani woman, but I'm also not the kind of Western woman that people are used to thinking about, and therefore I could be a woman. I could be a kind of basically I was like a third sex really, and sometimes that happened, especially when you had this very demarcated households where the women never met outside men. There was, I would arrive and I would be taken to the hujra, to the male guest house, would be sit and chat and have tea, and then suddenly people would remember that I was a woman, and then I would go into the house, and then I would never emerge again until I finally left. So it was very different. I think it's really a feature of being a woman that I'm afraid I especially have come to this realization, probably also quite late, but through writing about British history, that that there is just a fact, which is that that female experiences are not written about very often historically. Female leaders, if they existed, are often written out of history across the world, and this has been the case for at least several thousand years. And I found that when I got 2 years into writing this book, The Britannias, about Britain told through its islands, and I found myself just overwhelmed by the maleness of the entire project that I'd taken on. There were all these Roman soldiers running around in my head, and there were these Christian monks colonizing islands, and there were these Druid priests, and I thought, oh my God. And then I would go to these actual islands where these things had happened, and I would meet Christian monks, and I would meet British soldiers, and I would meet politicians who were men, and it became intolerable. And then I had this, thank God, I had this epiphany where I sat down and opened this book of poetry, Celtic poetry from 1957, and this amazing man who, alas, is dead, Kenneth Jackson, had written these 3 lines from an Irish early medieval poem, and it described this man who is lured away to the islands of women in the middle of the sea, and it was just a revelation to me. There was this counter history, this counter storytelling that had been there the whole time, and when I began to look for it and then piece it together, I drew it back to these Greek texts which described these islands of women in the British Sea, and these Roman accounts of these prophetesses who were living on these islands around the British Isles. And then I carried it forward into the Renaissance, where these male poets, for example, Edmund Spenser, who's Fairy Queen, I've just been reading for the first time in my life, he has these islands of women inhabited by these independent, sexy women in their own domain. And he describes them, and it's like the most sexy part of this entire epic poem. And then they have to destroy them. The Puritan, he's with this knight, Guyon is with this Puritan guide to these islands. And they go in and they gawp and they get aroused and they whatever. And then the moment comes where they have to kill off these women. And Spencer's unknowingly doing it for us. He's explaining to us, yes, we have these stories, we have this counterculture, and it's been there all along, but we can't deal with it. So we're just going to destroy it. And that was really a really huge awakening for me, that we just can't take it for granted that women's stories are going to be treated fairly, because it's just not the case.
Yeah, I think we've approached the end of our 45 minutes, but that's a good note to end on. I actually want to hear those 3 lines, but perhaps we can do that offline. The 3 lines that are beneath for you. I think what you said about a counter tradition in storytelling, I think all of the work that we've discussed and the work that you engage with offers us that. But what's really empowering, again, that word again for me, is that you're doing it quite naturally. That isn't a conscious kind of transgressive gene, saying, now let's go and break this or do that. It's coming naturally, and it comes from trusting yourself, as Taran said, in your own voice, or as Shubhangi experienced. There's something in there for me to learn, because that's very tough for a new writer, really, to trust your own experience and then your own voice. So thank you, everyone. That's been my big takeaway from the session.